This is the next lecture um, for tomorrow, July the 1st. And we're in chapter 8 now. I left off right about here in the chapter. What we need to do, and you need to memorize this, is that the 4 eons of geologic time for Earth history. The first is called the Hadean eon, and it goes from 4.6 billion years ago to 4 billion years ago. The next eon of geologic time is called the Archean, Archaean. It's about 4 billion years ago to 2.5 billion years ago. Then we have the Proterozoic that goes from Proterozoic eon goes from 2.5 billion years ago to 542 million years ago. And then we have the eon we're now living in called the Phanerozoic eon that began 542 million years ago. And it continues on till today. So there might be a question on the test where you have a rock and then you've used radioactive isotopes and you figured out how old that rock is. Let's say it's 3 billion years old. Well, what eon did it form in? Then you'd have to say the Archaean eon, right? So you need to know those eons. Okay. Let's start off talking about, if you took historical geology class, we talked about this over an entire semester, but you're getting this in about an hour and a half to 2 hours in physical geology. So I'm skipping a lot of things. I'm just going to cover some of the main points. There's a lot more to it than what I'm going to be talking about today, but I'm going to give you the main points. The Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, according to, I know it says 4.5 here in the book, but it should be 4.6. It formed 4.6 billion years ago, according to the solar nebular theory. And what was the Earth like back then? Well, it's hard to say, and I'll tell you why. Because there are no rocks from the Hadean eon. The oldest rocks we find on Earth are 4 billion years old, so they formed at the when the Hadean had already ended. But we do have inclusions, chunks of Hadean rock in Archaean rocks that are as old as 4.2 to 4.4 billion years old. We also know what the laws of physics are and chemistry, and so we can make a pretty good guess as to what Earth was like 4.6 billion years ago when it formed. Here's an artist's depiction of what the Earth would look like 4.6 billion years ago, and it's really apt if you think about it. It was like Hades during the Hadean. It was fire and brimstone. There was no life on the planet, probably, and I'll tell you why. First reason why we don't think there was life on the planet is when the Earth first came together, it must have been very, very hot. The surface of the Earth was covered by molten lava. We had volcanoes occurring everywhere, spewing more lava. So there was oceans of lava. We didn't have enough time yet to have lakes and oceans and things like that. There was, the crust hadn't even formed. And look at this right here. That's the moon. Look how close the moon was to the Earth back then. The moon, we think, formed 4.55 billion years ago from a collision between an asteroid that hit the moon, and it hit the Earth, and then a glob of this molten lava from the Earth was sent into orbit, and it orbited around the sun, orbited around the Earth starting about 4.55 billion years ago. So the moon must have originally been much closer to the Earth, and so the gravitational pull from the moon was stronger. So you had high tides and low tides of lava covering up any rock that had cooled down. This is not a place where you could have life. It would have destroyed any life. We had barely no atmosphere yet. The atmosphere took time to form, so we didn't have the life-giving gases. We didn't have protection from asteroids and comets and meteorites without an atmosphere. So the Earth was being struck by extraterrestrial objects. Volcanism was occurring. We had no crust. We had molten lava covering the planet, and high tides and low tides of lava running up any rocks that did manage to cool down due to the moon being so close to the Earth. So that's what we think the Earth was like during the Hadean. It was not a hospitable place. It was a awful, hellacious place. During the Hadean, maybe we started to form some crust. But we know definitely by the next eon geologic time, known as the Archean, then we would get honest to goodness continental felsic crust and oceanic mafic crust. So the crust may have started to form. I talked about the moon before. Here you can see, according to the giant impact hypothesis, which most scientists subscribe to, the Earth was struck by an asteroid or a comet or some large object, and some of this molten lava from the Hadean lava oceans was sent into orbit and started orbit around Earth. In other words, the moon came from the Earth. And the evidence for that is when the astronauts went to the moon, they were surprised. They thought maybe they'd find some really exotic, strange-looking rocks on the moon. But the moon, chemically speaking, is made up of the same stuff as the Earth's crust. It's the same, indicating that the moon came from the Earth. Well, where did the water on planet Earth come from? Without water, we cannot have life. Well, it came from two main sources. The first is from volcanoes. When volcanoes erupt, they release water vapor. So, if you went back to the 1980s and before, geologists would tell you that the water in the oceans, the lakes, and the atmosphere, it all came from volcanic outgassing. Not the kind of volcanic outgassing if you ate too many beans at a Mexican restaurant, but from the eruption of volcanoes and the release of water vapor into the atmosphere. But now more and more scientists are thinking that much of the water on planet Earth has an extraterrestrial origin. Recently, over the last 10 years, our spacecraft, unmanned spacecraft, have found that many asteroids consist mostly of ice. And since Earth didn't have too much of an atmosphere back during the Hadean, and when these large objects struck the planet, that's when the water was added. Much of the water was added to the planet. Obviously, it was hot on the planet, so this water evaporated, but it started to produce clouds. And with clouds, you get rain. And over hundreds of millions of years of it raining, do you think that might cool down the Earth? Yes, it did. It started to cool down the Earth. So maybe that's when we started to form our crust, both oceanic crust, which is mafic, and continental crust, which is felsic. The next eon of geologic time is called the Archaean eon. There's a spelling for it, ladies and gentlemen. The Archaean eon began 4 billion years ago and it ended 2.5 billion years ago. We have rocks, lots of rocks from the Archean, compared to almost nothing for the Hadean. So we know something more about the Archean. We know that the Earth started to cool down. We formed honest-to-goodness oceanic crust. And maybe a little bit of continental crust, but very small amounts. The big thing about the Archean is that's when life appeared on planet Earth. The earliest evidence of life is from these things called stromatolites in limestones. Let me show you what they look like. We have these in Tennessee too, by the way. So stromatolites, what are stromatolites? Well, in the rocks they look like this in limestones. You might have seen limestones that look like this, but luckily there's 1 or 2 places on the Earth where we still have stromatolites, such as here in Sharks Bay, Australia. And my PhD advisor, Bob Osborne, God bless his soul, he passed away. He was the only American to die from mad cow disease from eating contaminated beef. Really bad luck. But he used to go to Sharks Bay and to look at these stromatolites. And what we found is that there are tiny microorganisms that make up these huge mounds. And these creatures are microscopic. And let me show you what they look like. They're called Cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria they look like this. And notice they're green. Why are they green? Because they photosynthesize, just like plants do. So plants did not invent the technology of photosynthesis. These more ancient bacteria are the first organisms on planet Earth, as far as we know. Here in the year 2020, we have not found any fossils more ancient than these cyanobacteria. And they photosynthesize just like plants do. What is photosynthesis? Plants do it. Well, photosynthesis is where, and I'm going to write this for you here. You have plants take in water, and so do cyanobacteria. But plants take it in through their root systems, and they also take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they make glucose, which most people call sugar. And they release a waste gas, which is oxygen. It's a waste gas to plants and cyanobacteria, but obviously animals need to breathe. And they need to eat. But we need to breathe in order to survive. Animals do. All animals. Therefore, this is a very important gas that was being added into the atmosphere. Without it, there would be no animals on this planet, including humans. Bottom line is, the most ancient form of life that we know of formed during the Archaean eon, and they are these cyanobacteria that make up these stromatolites, which are these mounds. So the ones that have died are down here, and then the next generation is higher, and the youngest generation is on top. Only the top of this mound is alive. These are photosynthesizing creatures. And also, it's important to note that these are asexual creatures. What does that mean? Well, there are 2 forms of life on our planet: prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Okay? prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And all prokaryotes are asexual. They do not reproduce sexually. All sexual creatures, including animals and plants and funguses, believe it or not, plants and funguses are sexual creatures. They reproduce sexually. Another way of saying it is prokaryote organisms do not have gender. There's no male and female. Eukaryotes do have gender because they are sexual creatures. You might not think about plants being sexual creatures, but they are. For example, look at pine trees. Pine trees, you have those pine cones that as little kids we used to collect. Those are ovaries. Those have the seeds. And then you have pine tree, the male organs look like this. I'm sure you've seen them before on trees. And these are testes. So this is sexual reproduction. This pollen that's sent into the air is sperm. And then when it meets the pine cones with a female cone in it, and it meets the seed, it germinates it. So in early spring, when the pollen is all over the place, it's all over your car, it's all over your house, everything's been covered with sperm. You might say to yourself, honey, pass the towel. I'm sorry. That's not funny. That's really bad. But you got to have some humor. Otherwise, during quarantine, you go crazy. So, animals and plants and funguses are eukaryotes. But the first organisms to appear on the planet are prokaryotes, which are asexual organisms. Asexual. Let's take a look at the difference between a eukaryotic cell, like we have, and plants have, and funguses have, versus a prokaryotic cell. Okay, so sexual creatures have cells like this. These are eukaryotic cells, and they are they made this picture to make them look like they're similar in size, but eukaryotic cells can be hundreds or even thousands of times bigger than prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are bigger, and eukaryotic cells have a cell nucleus, which is walled off from the rest of the cell, by a nuclear membrane. And then they have all these little parts that are outside of the cell nucleus that are walled off from the rest of the cytoplasm, and they serve different functions. For example, animals have mitochondria in each cell. So do you. So do all animals. Mitochondria converts the food we eat into energy. Plants, on the other hand, have these green things in them called chloroplasts, and they take sunlight and they make their own food. Inside of the cell nucleus and the mitochondria for animals is DNA. And DNA makes you who you are. It makes you look the way you do. It gives you your height, your personality, your affinity to getting various diseases, your everything, your athletic ability, your intellectual ability. It's all stored in the DNA. And the DNA, half of it comes from your father and half of it comes from your mother. And that's how sexual reproduction works for eukaryotes. Please don't forget, stromatolites, which are made up of cyanobacteria, are prokaryotes. They are asexual creatures. They don't have a cell nucleus. They don't have these other parts, which are called suborganelles, walled off from the rest of the cell. Suborganelles are only in suborganelles. Suborganelles are only in eukaryotic cells. These are other parts that are walled off from the cytoplasm in the cell. So, how do asexual creatures reproduce? They don't do it through sex, they do it through cloning. In other words, they divide into two, and those two will divide into four, and those four will divide into eight. Each one a duplicate of the previous generation, each one a clone of the previous generation. So the first life that appeared on the planet was prokaryotic, and it's in these limestones of the Archean eon. The other thing that happened during the Archean that's important to remember is we started to form crust. Oceanic crust, which is mafic, and continental crust, which is felsic. So we started to form tiny little continents, and plate tectonics began during the Archean. So how did life begin? Well, if I told you that I knew the answer to that, I'd be lying. But I can't tell you that we know how life began on this planet. But I can tell you that it began about during the Archean eon, about 3 billion years ago, or maybe 3.5 billion years ago. Probably about 3.5 billion years ago, according to the newest evidence. And there's two main scientific theories regarding how life began on planet Earth during the Archean eon. And I'm going to write these down for you so you can put this in your notes. Holy Mother of God, I think I typed the right thing. Where is it? Okay, here. So the two main theories are the Stanley Miller hypothesis and then the hydrothermal hypothesis. These are the two main contenders for the origin of life on planet Earth. Let's first talk about the Stanley Miller hypothesis. Named after who? Who's buried in Grant's tomb? Ulysses Grant, right? Who's the author of the Stanley Miller hypothesis? Stanley Miller. Let's take a look at his experiment. Stanley Miller. Stanley Miller was a professor. There he is, later on in life. There he is as a young man. He was a professor at the University of California, San Diego. Incredible man. He worked into his 90s trying to figure out how life began on planet Earth. And he designed an experiment. Here he is later on in life showing what he did back in 1953. He set up this chemical apparatus to, right here he had water, and he mixed chemicals into this water, and this the chemistry of the water was equivalent to what was thought to be the composition of seawater during the Archean. So he tried to make a mixture that represented the ancient Archean oceans in this glass vessel. Then he mixed gases in this vessel representing the composition of the Archean atmosphere, which had a lot less oxygen than it does today. What are these two things? These are electrodes. And so he wanted to see what would happen if he shot electricity into the ancient atmosphere, representing lightning, and how that would change the chemistry of seawater back during the Archean. And to his amazement, Stanley Miller, through this apparatus, produced amino acids. So this shows his experiment here, and the water became a dark orange, and it was filled with amino acids. Amino acids. Did Stanley Miller make life in the laboratory? No. Did he make amino acids? Yes. What are amino acids? Amino acids are the building blocks of life, but they're not life. They're not cells. Cells can replicate, such as your blood cells, your bone cells, your skin cells. They can duplicate, and each time they duplicate, they know how to make the new cells through the DNA. The DNA is like a blueprint that's used every time a cell divides, which is called mitosis. Well, life is made of proteins. Animal life is made of proteins. Proteins are made up of chains of amino acids. Thousands and thousands of different amino acids lined up in a chain can make a protein. So, in Stanley Miller's eyes, he did the first step in making life. He made amino acids. But that is not even close to making life, because to line up those amino acids to make a protein, something has to happen to make that occur. And I'm really doubtful that this is the way life began, because how are you going to get all those amino acids to line up to make a protein and make a true cell? Doing so, the reason I'm really doubtful that life began this way is because if it did begin this way, how come we can't make any proteins in the lab even now in 2020? I don't think it's possible. But many scientists think that these amino acids could line up and eventually and make proteins. The farthest he got in making proteins was making proteinoids. What are proteinoids? I'm going to show you as soon as this page uploads. These little things here are called proteinoids, and they replicate, but they don't serve any function like an actual protein does. It serves a function within a body of an animal or a plant. So they don't metabolize. They don't serve any function. They just duplicate like bubbles. Now, Stanley Miller thought that this is an intermediate step. So first you formed amino acids through a lightning strike in the ancient Archean Ocean. Then these made proteinoids, and then proteinoids would somehow make proteins. Again, I'm doubtful about this because it hasn't been done, and people have been trying. I don't think it can be done, to tell the truth. But that's the one theory about how life began. The other theory has to do with hydrothermal vents. These are called black smokers. And what are they, these black smokers? They look like this, and we found them on the bottom of the ocean. Here you can see a submarine. It looks like a chimney with black smoke coming out of it. And when we look at this black smoke very carefully, we find it's filled with tiny little microorganisms, and these are creatures that are called Archaea, Archaea, and this is what they look like. Now, these tiny little creatures that we find in this superheated water, and we're talking about water up to 300 degrees Celsius, more than 500 degrees Fahrenheit, have been found on the bottom of the ocean. Well, some people think that this is how life began, and their argument goes like this. The genetic diversity within these creatures that live domain Archaea, which can live in very cold places and very hot places and extreme places. That's why some people call these things extremophiles. There's more genetic diversity within some of these pools of hot water than there is across the entire continent of Africa, Europe, and South America with all of the different animals. The only way you can get genetic diversity is if those organisms are ancient. And since these creatures have more genetic diversity, domain Archaea, than any organisms on the planet, that indicates that they must be the first form of life, according to these people who believe that life began with domain Archaea. Also, we know that during the Archean, the Earth was much hotter. Who else could survive under those extreme hot conditions but creatures like this, domain Archaea, along these hydrothermal vents? So their argument is twofold. They have more genetic diversity, domain Archaea, so they must be the most ancient form of life. And two, they could have existed under those extreme conditions of high temperature in the oceans during the Archean. It was hot in the oceans during the Archean, not as bad as during the Hadean, but much hotter than today. And so only these creatures could have survived, they say. But I see there's a flaw in their argument as well, if you think about it. And the flaw in their argument is, if these are the most ancient form of life, how come we don't find those fossils? The most ancient fossils we find are not these things. They are the stromatolites I talked about earlier on. So until we actually find some of these in very ancient rocks, about 3.5 billion years old, we can't. The data is not there to support this. But I had to tell you the two main theories regarding the origin of life during the Archean are the Stanley Miller hypothesis and the hydrothermal vent hypothesis. We do know one thing for sure, is life appeared on the planet during the Archean eon. The next eon is called the Proterozoic eon. It began 2.5 billion years ago, and it ended 542 million years ago. The significance of this eon of geologic time is the Earth was starting to cool down, but we had oxygen starting to build up in the atmosphere. Because you might recall, those cyanobacteria release oxygen. And we can see this because the rocks are starting to develop more and more hematite, the mineral hematite, which is rust. Rust only forms in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. So the Earth started to develop an oxygen-rich atmosphere, getting closer to today's oxygen-rich atmosphere. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, we have the appearance of gender, male and female, and sexual reproduction, and eukaryotes appear in the rock record during the Proterozoic. So, all of a sudden, we're in a world with gender and sexual reproduction during the Proterozoic. Life is starting to become more complex. And And we're starting to see, let me show you what types of fossils we have during the Proterozoic. We're starting to see things like the first sexual creatures, things like this. And these might not seem like too much to you, but these things are visible to the naked eye. So we're going from microscopic creatures to macroscopic creatures. Creatures are becoming larger and more complex, and they're sexual creatures. You might not think too much of this, but if this is a female acritarch and you're a male acritarch, you'd be looking at her and go, I cannot sleep at night. Think about those spikes on her. I'm just kidding. All right. But anyway, life is becoming larger, going from microscopic to macroscopic. It's going from asexual to sexual, and it's becoming more complex. Until finally, by the end of the Proterozoic eon, we have creatures that look like this. And this is called the Ediacaran Fauna, and it appears at the very end of the Proterozoic. The Ediacaran Fauna represent life becoming much larger. Look how large these creatures are. And how complex they are compared to what existed before. They are sexual creatures. Are these creatures related to modern life forms? The debate is still going on. Some people think that these things are related to today's jellyfish, and these things to worms. But we're not sure. But we know one thing for sure, is that by the end of the Proterozoic, life had become much larger and much more complex. And these are several inches long. We never had anything comparable during the Archean. Everything was microscopic. Now everything is much more complex, and sexual reproduction is there, and we have complex organisms, maybe even with organs like hearts and livers and kidneys, etc. So things are becoming larger, and the evidence for that is the Ediacaran fauna. We had plate tectonics occurring, and it probably began during the Archaean. Here's your stromatolites. Please don't forget cyanobacteria formed those. This is the earliest known life form. Here's your Ediacaran fauna. Finally, 542 million years ago is the beginning of the eon we're now living in, called the Phanerozoic eon, where all modern life forms appear. I'll stop here and I'll do more in the next film.